welcome everybody to our Bay Area Housing Market Town Hall. And this is our 12th episode. And today I'm very, very excited to have Daniel Bornstein to be our guest speaker. I already have requests for Daniel for a few months now. And finally, we have him here to speak on this very timely topic. And I want to say thank you, Daniel. And we are going to start with a little bit of a housekeeping items first. As you know, we started this since March 25th. Again, we are here to provide education directly to our consumers and also our real estate industry. We want to make sure that we can empower our consumers during this difficult time. There are a lot of information. We want to make sure that we keep you up to date. And I want to share this quote with you guys. This is by Maya Angelou. I have learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people would never forget how you made them feel. This is something I truly feel very strongly about, especially during this time. There are a lot of people who are really struggling, no matter if it's because of coronavirus or right now the fire. We've been doing a lot of help to people who are struggling right now. We have a grocery assistance program who we have been donating our own money to some of the grocery applicants to help them out with their 1 month grocery expenses. It is a difficult time right now, but you know what? Even you don't donate money, just donating your efforts, your time to listen to them during this time, it can be quite helpful. So just remember, it's not really about what you do, it's really about how you make people feel. And by doing these Bay Area Town Hall, Housing Market Town Hall is also something that we want to empower people so you feel comfortable when it comes down to your real estate investing. I doubt that you guys don't know who Daniel Bornstein is, but let me just introduce a little bit about him, and I'll let him introduce himself as well in a little bit. He is absolutely a well-respected authority in landlord-tenant disputes and property management issues. He has over 23 years of experience in handling real estate and civil litigation throughout the Bay Area. He manages rental properties, and he is instrumental in completing real estate transactions and is renowned for his educational seminars. He's been seen in a lot of different interviews, TV interviews, news, and I love the fact that he is truly a voice that is really helping the public to see from the landlord's point of view, because right now it seems like on the market people keep talking about that landlords are the greedy ones. So thank you so much, Daniel, for being here. Let me see if I can make sure that you are being seen as well. There you go.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So let us go ahead and start your presentation right now.
Sure. So thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's my privilege and pleasure to be here. And what I've asked to speak about is what is sort of the most compelling issue that we're all addressing today, which is the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on landlord-tenant law in California. And so what I'm going to be discussing is the recently enacted State Tenant Protection Act, which has impacted all of us throughout the state. And what I'm going to do is go through some of the new rules, go through some strategies, get you educated about nuances, and then I will leave myself open for questions that you may have at the conclusion of this. First and foremost, before I start, I want to emphasize the following. One slide before was an indication that there was a federal rule that impacted evictions throughout the country because of the Department of Public Health, or the CDC, excuse me. That would not have an impact in California because California has its own state law that would address the concerns of protecting tenants throughout the state. So you need not worry about the federal rule, but instead focus on what I'm going to be addressing today. So with that, Anthony, if you would kindly switch the slide, we can move on. So as recently as the first week of September, maybe 7-8 days ago, we had this enormous new law enacted in California, and it was to address the pandemic and the issue of tenant displacement throughout California that may occur or may have been likely to occur because so many Californians are suffering because of a loss of housing, loss of employment that is impacting their ability to pay the rent. What has happened since April in bullet point 1 is that courts have been largely closed to non-payment of rent cases. This has been inevitably very frustrating for owners, landlords, property managers who have tenants inside a unit who haven't been paying the rent, and the courts have simply been unopened for the pursuit of eviction or unlawful detainer actions, largely because of the judicial council closing down the court because of fear of contagion, and also to preclude people from potentially losing housing and becoming more vulnerable. As of September 2nd, the courts are reopening. That's important because with the courts reopening, we now have the infrastructure to pursue litigation that has been closed to many people through the springtime and summer of this year. However, non-payment of rent cases are only going to be permitted to be proceeded upon starting in October. Starting in October, you will be entitled to proceed with non-payment of rent cases under very limited circumstances. And let me go through the limited circumstances. If you proceed in a demand for rent of a tenant now, and the tenant asserts that they're unable to pay the rent because of a COVID-related hardship, you will not be entitled to proceed with your non-payment of rent case. Let me say that again. If you are an owner and you serve a notice and a tenant responds to the notice by indicating that they're unable to pay the rent because of a COVID-related hardship, you will not be able to proceed with an eviction action, even though the courts are open for non-payment of rent cases in October. Non-payment of rent cases in October that will be open are those tenants who have not suffered a COVID-related hardship and are simply not paying the rent. And that's going to be a different story. Before September, the type of notice in California that was permitted to be served to demand rent was what we all know, a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. It is now, as of September, a 15-day notice. So now your 3-day notice has been elongated to a 15-day notice, which means for those of you who are attending this seminar, congratulations, because throughout California, there will be people who are not aware of the law, are not aware of the changes, and are using their same 3-day notice to pay rent and demand it, and they're simply in contravention of the law. When you serve that 15-day notice, let's say the tenant has not paid the rent between June and August, and in September you serve a 15-day notice, you must include a document that a tenant can fill out to state that the debt in June and August that was not paid is directly related to COVID hardship. In that event, if a tenant returns that declaration, you're out of luck. You can't proceed with the eviction for that debt. And we will go on and further update this issue. But for now, I just want to leave you with that understanding. There is, for high-income renters, an obligation to provide documentation establishing distress and inability to pay the rent. But for the majority of tenants, all they need to do is sign a declaration. Another important point, throughout California, just cause eviction protections have been extended to all units until February 1st, 2020. So for instance, if you have a condominium in Concord or in Walnut Creek, and you did your learning and you learned that the state law exempts condominiums from just cause eviction rules, well, as of September 1st, between September 1st and February 1st, you are not allowed to terminate a tenancy without a just cause. You can't terminate simply because the lease is over. You can't tell a tenant to leave because their fixed term lease is over. This is inherently an extension of protections for tenants throughout the state, and it will occur until February 1st, 2021, excuse me. February 1st, 2021, the protection of just cause is throughout the state. For those tenants who have asserted that their COVID debt is related to a hardship, their debt will not be something that you can proceed for an eviction of, but instead you will be able to proceed in small claims court after March 1st of the following year. Which means for those of you who have rental property and a tenant has stopped paying the rent and they assert that it's a COVID-related debt, you may still be tasked with paying your utility bills, your property taxes, your mortgage payments, and you are not going to be able to expect payment of the rent for those who have followed the rules and provided the documentation establishing their hardship. This act has also put a limitation on what local governments can do to extend their own eviction moratoriums. And so, for instance, Alameda County has an eviction moratorium. Oakland has rules regarding moratoriums. Berkeley has rules regarding moratoriums. San Francisco has rules regarding moratoriums. This statewide initiative has put limitations on the local moratoriums and what they cannot do. It is a patchwork of rules and regulations, and this state law has attempted to try to put some sort of semblance of order on this patchwork. Let's move on to the next slide. This is the important aspect that you need to understand. And this is a core component of this new state law. Rent that was missed from March 1st through August 31st, 2020, you can demand it in a 15-day notice right now. However, if a tenant responds by filling out a hardship document, which we will provide to any of you who want, the tenant need not pay that debt, and that debt will be something that you can recover in small claims court starting in March of next year, but you're stuck not being able to capture it now. This is the first time in the history of my law practice where a debt that's treated as rent is not something that you can act upon in an eviction lawsuit. It's something that you're going to have to wait until March of next year to seek recovery of in small claims. What this means is that there will be a deluge of small claims filings come March for a debt that arose during the most crucial part of the COVID pandemic, hopefully the period of March through August of 2020. Commencing September 1st, if rent is not paid for September, October, November, December, January, and you serve a 15-day notice, the tenant can simply file the hardship document, but in this period of time, in order to preclude an eviction lawsuit, the tenant has to pay 25% of the total rent owed, and you must inform them of that. So prior to September 1st, all of the rent can be delayed until you proceed in small claims court. Starting September 1st through January 2021, a tenant must pay 25% of the total rent due each month. That may not be a great consolation, but at least it's some amount of money. Which means a tenant who files a hardship document indicating they're unable to pay the rent, and you demanded it for September, and then they refuse to even pay 25% of the rent, you do have the right to file the eviction. When? October 5th of next month. What type of notice will it be? A 15-day notice to pay rent or quit. What will the notice have to accompany? A declaration that a tenant can fill out claiming a COVID hardship and a bunch of other information that's required to be provided to tenants. I can only say that the documents that you may have in your database for demanding rents are no good right now. The whole state must operate under new documents, under new disclosures, and if you don't have those documents, you want to be very careful. Do not serve notices that are not effective. The one big caveat is that there's a means testing part of this. So high income renters must, if they're going to assert a COVID related hardship, they're going to have to provide information and proof that their COVID hardship is legitimate in order to avail themselves of the protection of the delay in payment for March through August, and also the right to pay only 25%. So there is a means testing. So if you are an owner and you know your tenant is a wealthy tenant living in a big expensive condo or home, and they're above the median income for that locale, and we can provide that information to you, you are entitled to expect more documentation from them. A simple statement that a COVID hardship is precluding them from paying the rent is not going to be sufficient. Rest assured though, for the vast majority of people, a simple document will stop the eviction process prior to August 31st, 2020, and then after August for September through January, as long as they assert a hardship and pay 25% of the rent for September, October, November, December, and January, you are out of luck. Meaning the debt is not going to be something that you can act upon through an eviction action. The debt is something that you will proceed in small claims court with. Let's move on. So I've mentioned increased documentation requirements. So I can only emphasize that the notices that we will be serving are going to be distinctly different than what you may have in your database. And for many people who are using Nolo Press or pulling documents off the internet, you're doing yourself a disservice. For the period of now until the end of January, it is essential that you reach out to an attorney who is aware of the laws, conversant in them, and has access to the proper database so that when we do make a demand for payment, it is consistent with all of the requirements of the current law that became effective in September. And so there are two different notices, one for debt between March and August, and one for debt between September and January. The notice must be properly served, and the tenants must be provided additional disclosure documentation so they're put on notice of what their rights are. Interestingly, the California Association of Realtors was very proactive, and the California Apartment Association was very proactive, and they created documents available to the community that meet these requirements. So for those of you who are in jurisdictions that don't have a local ordinance, you can access these documents from the California Apartment Association if you're a member. If you're not a member, I'll be glad to provide you access to some of these documents so that you can use them and not be out of compliance with the law. I will tell you that the amount of documents that are necessary now in order to demand rent is astonishing. And for, I would say, 9 out of 10 people who are not aware of the law, you're simply going to be serving notices that are not enforceable and can create liability for yourself. So you really want to be careful. And I assure you, there are brilliant tenant attorneys who would love for you to make a mistake in order to create liability for yourself, because the law, this new law, includes a penalty, a financial penalty for proceeding in contravention of the law. So you want to really be careful about what you do. When in doubt, I welcome an opportunity, an email to me about what's happening, and I'm happy to assist you in making an evaluation of what you can and can't do. And be advised, I have clients, they're reaching out to me and they have $15,000 in debt, $20,000 in rent debt, $25,000 in rent debt, because starting in March, a tenant informed them that they lost their job, their rent was $5,000 a month, and they have not received rent for that period of time. It's very painful. The state has at least provided guidance on what we can do now. It's just the documentation required is very complex and cumbersome. Happy to provide those documents for you. Let's move on.
Hey, Daniel, I wanted to mention one thing that some people, obviously, they have property managers and some they might be managing the properties themselves. This is a reminder for everybody that make sure your property manager worked with a real estate attorney to have the most up-to-date documentations.
Yes, and that's a very good point. I want to say this. Property management typically requires 3 core aspects. Excellent communication between the property manager and the tenant and the owner. Excellent accounting, because accounting is so crucial to making sure your records are done correctly. And then in California, legal. And many property managers are excellent communicators, have good bookkeeping, but the law is so complex. They can have a failure not because they're not wonderful people, but because the law is inherently complicated. 2020 in California has become the most complicated time in landlord-tenant law ever. I am starting to get exhaustion from all of the information I have to learn on a daily basis. For example, in 2020, state rent control came into effect. State just cause eviction came into effect. Then we had the pandemic. Then we had the introduction of local rent control ordinances. We then had the introduction of local buyout ordinances. And then we had, of course, the pandemic. And this new law that came into effect in September is 20,000 words. It's not a 5-page doc. To even read a shortened version of it is an 18-page document from the California Apartment Association. So do not expect your property managers to be on top of this because it is so cumbersome and challenging. Your property manager should instead have their attorney handle the rent demands at this point in time if you're formally going to demand that 15-day notice for pre-September rent and after September 1st, the post rent. And why do I have this next slide in front of me? Tenant surrender of possession agreements. Right now, pursuing eviction actions on non-payment of rent cases, while you may be entitled to do so, the optics of it are not ideal. Why? Because when we file an eviction action, we're seeking to remove someone from a property, and oftentimes it places everybody in a state of stress, anxiety, and possible homelessness. So all things being considered, knowing that the COVID pandemic is still upon us, knowing that COVID-related debt is going to be transitioned into consumer debt and you'll only be able to go to small claims court, I'm often giving people advice. Before you start a process to demand rent and proceed with an eviction action, you may want to have a dialogue with your tenant and say to them, for example, Jane, I recognize that you have a COVID-related impact in your life. I want you to know that rent is due and owing, and you owe a debt of in excess of $7,500. You've also communicated to me that you have no idea of when you're going to start to have work again because you're an independent contractor and the work has stopped. I am entitled to all of the rent, and it may not be through the demand of a 3-day notice, but it will ultimately be something that I am going to seek from you. I'm prepared instead to create a win-win situation for both of us, which is I would be willing to consider you transitioning out of the property, transparent on your terms. In exchange, I would be willing to waive the rent. And if you can reach an agreement for a tenant to voluntarily move out in exchange for a rent waiver, that may be faster, cheaper, more efficient, less acrimonious than pursuing an eviction lawsuit. And why do I say that? Because my retainer typically on an unlawful detainer action will be at minimum $5,000. When you start an eviction action, the biggest variable of how long it's going to take and how difficult it's going to be is what the tenant does in terms of retention of another attorney and how hard they fight. With the court just opening up, the court is going to have a limited amount of courtrooms. Things are very, very, very slow. So a lawsuit filed in October for non-payment of rent that occurred in the summer may not get to closure until January, February, March of next year. And if a tenant said, look, I'll move out the end of October, if you waive the money that I have owed you thus far, you can keep the security deposit. I will strongly recommend you do that deal. Because I'm happy to pursue a landlord-tenant dispute. My hourly fee is $500 an hour. You may end up wishing you had waived the rent and gotten to a deal because that's the fastest and cheapest way to recover possession of the unit. All things being equal, a vacant unit is much more preferable than an occupied unit with a tenant in it not paying the rent. You want to recover possession as fast and as cheap as possible, taking into account attorney fees, time, and risk. And if it means waiving the rent to secure the keys, that may be a prudent approach. So you can then start to market the property to those people who are actively able to cover the rent and have some sort of stability in their life. Now, this, of course, requires cooperation and compromise of the tenant. And sometimes we're offering money, including a rent waiver for a transition. And this only works if a tenant has other options. And many of the tenants who are willing to transition out may be transitioning back home to live with family, maybe leaving the state to move back to a location that's more financially reasonable for them. But I want to emphasize, during this next period of time, even though the courts are opened up, even though there's a solution that you can demand on a 15-day notice unpaid rent, I still strongly recommend that you focus on a negotiated voluntary vacancy, because in the end, that will be probably the fastest and least expensive approach to recovering possession. And remember, if we proceed with an unlawful detainer action or an eviction action, you may spend all the money to get a judgment against a tenant, but it's a piece of paper. It says they owe you money. A judgment is not the same thing as collections. So if you get a judgment, you don't hire me to go and collect it because I don't do collections. You then have to go to an attorney who does collections, or you may have to go to a collection agent who may take 60 cents on the dollar of whatever they collect. So thinking that you're going to recover funds come March when you file a small claims action may be unlikely. You may get a judgment, but you may have no ability to collect. So I'm all about fastest, cheapest, smartest approach to recovering possession during this pandemic. Now,
and that's such a good point, because like if some people are really considering selling their building because they're so tired of dealing with this, it is true that it is probably better, it's not probably, it is better to have vacant units when you sell than to have a unit that's have non-paying tenants, because buyers don't want to deal with that. They can deal with a vacant unit, they cannot deal with a tenant who would not be willing to pay.
Agreed 100%. And if you are representing a seller with a tenant in possession with a COVID-related hardship, that's going to be a tricky sales process. And you have to consider whether it's more prudent to negotiate a voluntary move out. Wait until you have some clarity about the tenancy before you market it, because that will attract very aggressive buyers trying to find a great deal at an under market value, because they're going to take on the problem that you aren't able to resolve. So you have to be strategic about this. And I'm always willing and able to speak with clients about options so that they're making great decisions about the sales process. I have a property management company. I am a broker, but in the concept of consulting about what to do with a failed landlord-tenant relationship inside a unit that you want to sell, the easiest solution, negotiate a voluntary move out. And I like to do that well before you market the property for sale. Now, I want to emphasize, in jurisdictions that don't have local ordinances, a buyout agreement is relatively simple for my office to prepare. In 48 hours, I can prepare the agreement once this information is provided. But in places like San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, that have their own buyout rules and regulations, you need to know the rules and regulations before you open your mouth, because there are disclosure obligations. And if you fail to comply with the disclosure obligations, you don't have an enforceable agreement and you can be sued. So you've got to be careful. And remember, when we're doing a buyout agreement, it's not simply you're giving people money or a waiver of rent in order to move out. You're not only getting a voluntary move out for cash, you're also getting an agreement that they're giving up all claims against you, the agents, and everything. So it's a release of liability as well. So that has to be a key component of the agreement. So let's move on for a second to the next slide, and then I'll take some questions. So this is the eviction process. It has not changed throughout California at this moment, but for, if you see on the top left-hand corner, 3-day notice, it's now a 15-day notice for non-payment of rent. It's now a 15-day notice for non-payment of rent. Still 3-day notice for violation of lease agreements. Still 3-day notice if someone engages in a criminal act. Someone engages in illicit drug use. You have someone engaged in violence inside the building. Still a 3-day notice. But for non-payment of rent, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're now going to be faced with a 15-day period. That 15-day period will be good through the end of the year, beginning of February, and then hopefully we'll segue back to the old 3-day notice process. But I will tell you, don't be surprised if in February or January, some of these rules get extended. So now we have state just cause eviction across all residential units, but for a small limited amount. And that includes single family homes and condominium units. I am concerned that this law will end up becoming somewhat revised in the future that may impact our rights and regulations. Also remember, in November, there is a ballot initiative that may further constrain rent increases because of the limitation and the amendments on Costa-Hawkins. I'm happy to discuss all of this at another time if you invite me again, but my core goal was to give you an introduction on what's just happened in September. And I want to emphasize, I'm here and available to answer questions that people have. And to the extent there's documents or information that you would like, all I ask you to do is email me, and I can email you the documents or have someone email you the documents. And be careful, it's a very cumbersome and challenging time right now, not only because of the optics of being aggressive with rent, but also because of the documentation that's required. So with that, Helen, we can change the slide and I can just open it up for questions. And I want to thank you and also Anthony for being available and helping coordinate this discussion for people.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that they can email you. So which email address is it? Is there a specific email address that you want them to email it to?
Yeah, that would be fine. Daniel@bornstein.law.
Okay, I'm typing it into the chat box. So all of you, if you need to email Daniel to ask for more information about these forms, please do so. So we do have 7 questions in the Q&A box. Let me start with Carrie. Carrie had asked, I would like to know what specific forms I must give to my tenants in Oakland. I understand I need to turn in 1, notice of COVID-19 Relief Act of 2020 and send a blank COVID hardship declaration form. I don't understand how I can send a hardship declaration form within the 15-day notice to pay or quit with the eviction moratorium.
Okay, so this is a very interesting question. So what we have in Alameda County is an eviction moratorium precluding evictions until the end of the year. And so what we have is a state regulation that is tried to address all of the states, and then we have the impact of a local regulation that is addressing a local ordinance. And when I talk about Oakland, I'm really now talking about Alameda County, because the Alameda County supervisors has extended the eviction moratorium until the end of the year. So what I would potentially do is I would serve the hardship doc. I could write a letter demanding rent, but I don't think right now I would ever contemplate in Alameda County filing a non-payment of rent case at this juncture.
Great.
And Alameda County has already designated COVID-related rent as debt that would be, you're entitled to proceed in small claims court, but not through an eviction action. And furthermore, right now, for all of those tenants throughout the state who have missed payments from March through August, before the end of this month, you're supposed to send them a notification of information regarding COVID-19. And I presume that many people will not do that, but I presume that the people who are on this seminar are happily able to ask me for the document, and I will PDF it to them so that they have that document available.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so another question is, what is considered a small landlord for the foreclosure protection, and have there been any guidelines on how one is afforded that protection?
Very good question. I do not have the answer to that particular question. What I would invite is you email me that question, and after this, I'll provide a better guidance than something off the cuff. And let me emphasize, as a promise to everybody, I know what I know, and what I don't know, I'll get to you, but I will not off the cuff make an assessment of something that's pretty tricky.
Absolutely. I love that. I think that's true professional, because you don't want to just provide any kind of service without knowing the detail. Let me go to the next one. Is also through an anonymous attendee. How can a landlord verify whether or not the tenant has actually experienced a COVID-related hardship, making them unable to pay rent? Meaning, do they simply have to assert the claim, or can one require documentation like unemployment documentation, doctor's note, etc.?
Very good question. So during my discussion, I emphasized that for people who are not high income earners, all they have to do is complete the hardship document that's going to be provided to them. They don't have to do anything else. For high income earners, they're going to have to provide you documentation. Now, my experience thus far is that most people are remaining paying their rent. But there's a large group of people who are not paying the rent, and by and large is because of a COVID-related impact. There are some people who are gaming this pandemic, unfortunately, but in some respects, they're likely to be a minority of the group who are largely affected. The unfortunate thing for me is as follows. We have created so much work to allow someone to assert a hardship while still maintaining an owner's obligation to pay their obligations. I would have much preferred a public policy where individuals who needed assistance were able to get quick, interest-free loans to pay rent so that we don't have to go through all this administration. And I think in the end, that's the public policy decision that I think failed us, which is a quick pool of resources to allow people who legitimately need money to pay rent to have access to that rent debt. And that's something that I think the politicians missed on this. And they've created a logjam of crisis and a cascading of administrative nonsense and bureaucracy in simply trying to get rent paid. And now the landlords are largely holding the sort of risk on this. And
I absolutely agree with you. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, it's like this analogously. Housing is obviously crucial, but so is food. And the idea of someone coming into a supermarket, taking bread, meat, eggs, and other important edibles, and then writing an IOU to a Safeway clerk, leaving with the items, and then saying, you know, I can't pay it, but you can file a small claims court action against me in March to recover the debt while they're already using the food. Well, that's akin to what's happening here. They're using the housing, and they're obligated to pay that in a small claims judgment sometime later, but the administration of having to collect it is terrible. So it should have been a societal burden of everybody sharing the obligation, and that's not what this law has been set up to do, unfortunately, for that core group of people who are in the real estate investing or small property owner segment.
I cannot agree with you more. I mean, in addition to that, I actually have been having this same sentiment is that, well, if they do offer the interest-free loan for people to pay for rent, it needs to be more like a rent voucher that only go towards rent and food. I think that would go a long way, that really, because housing and food are two most important things that everybody needs. And right now, people are really worried about their housing. And this shouldn't be the case if the public policy had been done a little bit better job on that.
Yeah.
Okay, and let's see. So we have another one. Any further news regarding the backlog of evictions that need to be processed and how courts are planning to handle this onslaught cases? Yeah. Are courts planning on processing UD filings via video call similar to other states?
Very good question. So I have an enormous amount of cases that are in a suspended state of ambiguity. They started in the winter, and all of a sudden COVID-19 slowed things down. And so cases that should have been resolved in March are now potentially coming to trial in October. And they've been continued and continued. And all I can tell you is every county has a different culture within the courts. Alameda is terrible in terms of the timing of matters and the delay. San Francisco is slow. San Mateo is fundamentally closed, and they are opening up. But the problem is there's a disincentive to have jury trials because people need to not be in close proximity with each other. So jury trials, which is a right of all defendants, including tenants facing an eviction action, are very slow and cumbersome. So I can only say that right now, the delay is ongoing. It's likely only to get worse as the court opens up to these post-pandemic non-payment of rent situations. And that's why when I spent 15 or 10 minutes talking about buyout agreements, avoid the courts. Avoid the attorney that puts you into the courts, because it is a slow process. Where I used to say an unlawful detainer action can take 8 to 12 weeks, I can't tell you how long it's going to take now. And right now, for instance, I had cases set to go to trial on Monday. The court sent me to a settlement conference, not to a trial. And the settlement conference was conducted by a Zoom meeting, and there's no indication of what happens if we're not able to resolve the matter, because there isn't any case courtrooms available. And courtrooms are as follows. Criminal cases have precedence. Unlawful detainer actions are supposed to have precedence, but there's only going to be so many courtrooms available for them, so you will be stuck in line. So all things being equal, be proactive in trying to resolve your disputes without the need to go to court, because even with the courts opening up, it's going to be a very, very difficult process.
Absolutely. It is definitely unprecedented. And there's another question regarding the specific instruction. What is the proper documentation? I think Daniel had already mentioned that. Can email him if you need exactly what kind of documentation. Appears most legislation is still heavily favored towards tenants. Are there any news on helping landlords, especially those that own, manage small portfolios or buildings?
I would only suggest that you wait and see with the federal law package, whether there's going to be some sort of mortgage relief or some sort of federal program to assist those owners who are in crisis. And that I am at times, and people are asking me, well, how are you practicing law with the courts being closed? I'm doing a lot of commiserating. I'm doing a lot of empathy, but I don't have that many solutions for people. Now, the solutions are coming forward, but they're very cumbersome. And sometimes if you serve a 15-day notice with the disclosure telling a tenant to fill out a COVID hardship, well, you're telling them exactly how they can keep the unit without paying too much rent. And then informing them that, by the way, you'll be faced with a small claims court action in March on this. So it provides a lot more information that, while certainly important to disclose, gives the tenant a recipe for further inertia and delay, which is harmful, obviously, to people who are dependent upon that rent money to pay their bills.
Yeah, and for those federally backed mortgages, if those landlords have those, then they have up to 18 months on the forbearance on those mortgages. So definitely check with your lenders to see. But apparently California, they said that they are going to work on more regulations to help the landlords, but they're trying to do one step at a time.
Yes, and that there was no cooperation of the banks with this recent tenant protection ordinance.
Yeah. Okay, and there's another one. Are the tenants informed of the declaration of hardship? I'm not exactly sure what that means.
Yeah, you have to inform them.
Yeah, okay.
It's a
And
requirement to be delivered.
great. And please go ahead and send Daniel an email regarding documentation. If the landlord is awarded a judgment in small claims for the rent owed prior to September 1st, how long will the tenant have to remit the payment for the back owed rent?
Yeah, so very good question. So a judgment is a piece of paper. It doesn't permit you to evict because the court is not allowing you to use that money to evict, because normally you would serve a 3-day notice in another life.
Mm-hmm.
Now what you have is a judgment, and now you can go and collect it. But collecting on a judgment of someone who doesn't have much economic health is really a recipe in futility. And tenant debt is not high debt. So if the tenant is without a job and the tenant has a judgment against them, there's not much you can do. You can't garnish their wages because they don't have a job. You can file the abstract of judgment in the location where the tenant is living, and maybe 5 years from now, if a tenant would get their economic health better and they're pursuing a loan or something, they'll come back and pay the judgment in order to clean up their credit. But other than that, there's not much you can do. So there's no guarantee of payment. And in some respects, I think, interestingly, all of this COVID-related debt is potentially assignable. And my expectation with the debt industry is that people will be purchasing tenant debt and then doing collections on tenant debt, because we're going to be talking about literally hundreds of millions of dollars of tenant debt throughout the country.
That's a very good point. It feels like it's back to 2008.
It's an unfortunate situation, and the real unfortunate aspect is if someone can't afford to pay the rent, the hope is that they would transition out. This situation provides the right to remain in possession and only allows a judgment to be entered, which doesn't solve the problem of I've got someone who didn't pay the rent and didn't move out, which is usually what we expect in a landlord-tenant relationship.
Absolutely. Now, Daniel, it is 5:02 right now. I don't know if you have a few more minutes to answer the rest of the questions.
Sure. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you. Will a property manager be able to act on our behalf to start the small claim court to go after missing rental payments, or do we have to initiate this process ourselves? Do you recommend to hire an attorney to handle this efficiently?
So in small claims court, what has happened is they've enlarged the right to, it used to be a jurisdictional number of 10,000. They've enlarged the amount you can seek in small claims court. So it is above 10,000, and you can file multiple small claims actions. So if you're a individual who has 30 tenants who haven't paid COVID-related debt and it's been transitioned to consumer debt, you can file those claims. My suggestion would be this, that you do it in your own name and not your property management company's name, because the judgment creditor will be the person who is owed the debt. And it's not that difficult to file a small claims action. I will tell you that I'm happy to assist in the drafting of it, but in small claims, you cannot have attorney representation in small claims unless it's a small claims appeal and you were a defendant and a plaintiff. So your obligation is typically to represent yourself. You can ask your property manager to handle it and show up, but you want you to be the plaintiff, so the judgment is for you, not for your property management company. Because if you transition from that relationship and the property management company is holding the judgment, how are you going to collect? And then you've got this issue of expecting the property management company to collect on your behalf, and it can be a little bit of a mess. So my recommendation would be to, one, maybe get a template of a small claims document from an attorney, and then draft your first one up. I'm happy to look at it, and then you can draft multiple up. And what I would say is file them at the same time in March and have the same date and you have 10 tenant claims on the same date, so you don't have to keep running to small claims court over the course of the next 3 months.
I cannot imagine on March 1st how many claims they're going to receive. My God.
It's a recipe for a very clogged and cumbersome situation, and that's why I think it would have been better, as I mentioned,
Right.
provide free interest loans for rent, so we don't get into this mess where the courts are not really able to handle the deluge that may occur.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, next question. Any difference in commercial retail store in San Francisco has not paid rent since March and refused to work or communicate with the landlord?
So the state ordinance that came into effect in September expressly involves residential, not commercial. So what I talked about today was residential based. San Francisco has a particularized moratorium on eviction of commercial tenants for non-payment of rent where their gross receipts are lower than $25 million a year, which it sounds like from your example, their gross receipts are less than 25 million a year. My suggestion is to contact me and I can talk to you about when the eviction moratorium is over for commercial tenants and how we can go about collecting that unpaid rent. It does not get converted to consumer debt per state law.
Perfect. And I think this is a great last question here to close out this segment. What does Daniel think will happen if we get a new president or current president stays?
You know, today was a unusual day with this orange tint throughout the city. I have no understanding of what is going to occur. I'm taking things one day at a time. And my only hope is that we're all able to manage ourselves successfully and maintain a positive orientation and stay healthy, because the next 4 months are incredibly risky. And I can only say is I'm hoping that trends sort of emerge, that the pandemic is reduced, things get to some sort of semblance of reality. And my hope is that whoever is in Washington is thinking coherently about an overall economic strategy that is not going to put us at risk. I will say that I'm pleased with the sort of health, seemingly, of the real estate market, because those charts that you are providing is different than what one would guess we would be in. And it probably is a confluence of a lot of factors, which is 1, skittishness of keeping money in the market, securities. 2, interest rates being very low. 3, people migrating from high rental units to other places. And 3, the fact that we have, before the pandemic, a relatively strong economy, and the government did a decent job of pumping a lot of money in to the economy at the initial part of the crisis. They just didn't deal with the rent. So my only concern is that if we don't get our act together, the collapse of this economy is going to be woefully problematic for real estate. And if we have a more horrific unemployment numbers and job shedding even greater, we're going to have more pain. And that's something that I hope to avoid, because I am also someone who wants to see things emerge in a much more healthy, sustainable approach for everybody, whether you're a landlord, a tenant. We really do wish good health and economic well-being for everybody. So, you know, that's my soliloquy. All I can say is that I can't predict the future, and the future starts to get stranger and stranger, and I'm looking for boring, right? I'm looking for not waking up and seeing black skies and then it turn orange. It's sort of shocking.
It just seems like our lives have been so interesting these days. And I absolutely agree with you. It's like the tenants and landlords, all these bills that being proposed. I hope that we have some more balanced bill that can really protect both. And like what you were saying earlier, interest-free loan for tenants that go towards only rents and food, that will really help a lot of people out, I think. But unfortunately, we're not there right now. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate and grateful for the fact that you're here to speak to all of us and answer all these questions. I truly hope that we can have you back next time so you can answer even more questions.
there's a lot still occurring, and November election will impact California as well. And I'm happy to be a voice for you. And it's my pleasure to be invited to share my information to your audience. And don't be a stranger, my email is available, and I'm happy to supplement this discussion with more information so that you make good decisions about your real estate.
That would be great. And thank you everybody for being here. And same thing, we just want to provide you with all this information so we can empower you to be a smart real estate investor or whatever situation you're in. And I hope that you guys will come back next month. It's second Wednesday, the second Wednesday every month from 4 to 5 p.m. Pacific time. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for watching our YouTube channel. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like our videos, make some comments, because we're gonna keep you posted on the most updated real estate news, housing market data, and also real estate tips and advice from all over the real estate industry. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.